to get into our discussion, and we do have some discussion questions to look at, but I wanted to ask first if you had any thoughts on that opening Jeremiah, to use a historical term, or if you wanted to think a little bit about what you found the most interesting throughout the year as we've been studying. What topics, what explorations did you find eye-opening or interesting, worth studying more? What did you enjoy most over the course of the year in terms of specific areas?
Well, for me is that, throughout the ages, Jews have always been questioning things. And it just kind of reinforces, what we know today versus, back then.
Right. Although they've been getting in trouble for questioning things for a long time, too. You
Well,
ask questions that are too far, then you got a problem.
Well, I think for me and Kathy, a lot of this was new. And I have to say that you've untangled a number of threads for me, about the, some of the biblical stuff and the archaeological stuff. And I found that all very interesting, and I've read further on that so that it's confirming it. But an awful lot of the early history was sort of interesting to go over, as opposed to just read it in the Bible, but to actually get a sense of what was going on. But also the sense of diversity, from Yemen to Shanghai to, all over the place, it makes for, as you say, a very human story, and one very understandable, and in many ways more digestible than the mythology. If that makes sense.
Sure. Well, and if you take the traditional version of Jews lived in a bubble and just sort of traveled through history, and they always did the same things, and they always followed the law, and they were always traditional. Well, look at the genetics, look at the faces. I mean, it's clearly not true. And again, that's not interesting. People traveling in a bubble and never changing. Like that what kind of a movie is that?
My initial thought was, well, gosh, that's a hard question. I found the whole thing delightful. There's just so much interesting stuff that I really enjoyed. But then I really do thinking about like what I've sort of taken out of it the most when in discussions with other people, and a lot of just the fact of how not homogenous Jews have always been. There's always been a bunch of different opinions and a bunch of different factions, or whatever you call them. And there's never been just one sort of homogenous way of doing it. And it's always been changing and adapting. And it's really cool learning about the details of all that, being able to talk about it.
Great. I love the experience when we have people come to our bar and bat mitzvahs, and it's the first time they've ever been to a bar and bat mitzvah, and they see what we do and they think, wow, you Jews do these fantastic ceremonies. And I think to myself, well, this is very different from the bar and bat mitzvah you might see somewhere else. But I'm glad you liked it, and it is also Jewish. It's just the assumption from the outset is all Jews do it all the same. And that's not true. And Jews know that. But sometimes it's good to be an ambassador. So the first question, how is modern Jewish life continuous with and different from the sweep of Jewish history? So I started by talking about this in some detail, but if you have any other thoughts on continuities or differences between historic Jewish life and Jewish life today, feel free to drop them in. I will give you one more I didn't mention. Jewish authority is at an all-time low. I'm not worried of facing Spinoza-like consequences, right? In fact, Mordechai Kaplan, the founding thinker of today Reconstructing Judaism, formerly Reconstructionist Judaism, he was excommunicated for his prayer book, I think in 1945. They actually burned copies of it because they thought it was so heretical. Some New York rabbis excommunicated Kaplan, who himself, by the way, had been ordained by an Orthodox rabbi. And as an Orthodox rabbi himself, his first job was at an Orthodox synagogue. He's one of the founders, by the way, of the Young Israel movement, which was a sort of modern Orthodox outreach organization. They won't mention him at all in their literature online, by the way. But he was one of the founders when he was still an Orthodox rabbi, but he had become so heretical, they tried to excommunicate him. It made not one bit of difference. He kept his professor position at the Jewish Theological Seminary for another 20 years because he'd been there for 30 previous years. I mean, it didn't affect his life at all. And where for Spinoza, that was a big deal. And there were two other figures in that same era in Amsterdam, Uriel da Costa and Juan del Prado, who facing excommunication relented and regretted their statements. Galileo as well had a similar kind of persecution by the religious establishment and had to make a public retraction of his heretical statements, even though supposedly under his voice he said, "And yet it moves." You might tell me that the earth is standing still and make me say it, but it's still moving. But the reality is that Jewish authority today in the ultra-Orthodox world, they might have authority over their people. That might not have changed very much. But there are even people leaving those communities. And beyond those communities in the Reform, conservative, secular Jewish world, which is 80% of American Judaism, we're making our own choices out here. Again, unforeseen before. And I will point out again how different that is, where in 1700, the vast majority of Jews were what today we would call some variety of Orthodox. They kept kosher, they observed Shabbat, they listened to the rabbis. Today, the vast majority of Jews in the world, even in Israel, are non-Orthodox. They might be conservative, reform, traditional, they might choose their own label, but they don't follow everything to the nth degree that an Orthodox rabbi would tell them to do. They're in some ways free Jews instead of frum Jews. They're not pious in the same traditional ways, and that's a radical change. Lori, were you going to add something in?
I had a question actually.
Mhm.
So I had never heard the term excommunicate used before in a Jewish context.
Mhm.
I was excommunication in Catholicism very specific about what it means.
Right.
And in terms of, is it a similar idea that you're being condemned? Or is it just sort of more like a shunning in a sense?
Well, Jews didn't have the power to enforce a death penalty, so it wasn't quite the same, life or death circumstance for them, but it was much more like a shunning. You can actually look up the writ of excommunication that was published against Spinoza, and you'll see it says nobody in the Jewish community is to do business with him or talk with him or marry his kids. I mean, like there's a whole litany that the kids one isn't in Spinoza's, but that's one of the consequences. Once you're in cherem, once you're in ban, and by the way, the Arabic word haram has the same root of, banning, shunning, beyond the pale, to, again, use a Jewish metaphor. You were an untouchable, right? You were just beyond the acceptable community. So this was more often used as a threat, because remember, in a pre-modern setting, if you were expelled from the Jewish community, you had nowhere to go, right? Because your right of residence and employment was based on the Jewish community. And if they kicked you out, then you're stuck. So it was more often used as a threat, and people backed down because they knew the consequences. If it had hit them, they would have to leave and convert because they had no other way to be where they were until the modern era, which is one of the reasons why Spinoza is sometimes seen as the first modern secular citizen, because he left the Jewish community, but stayed in Amsterdam. And he went by Benedictus Spinoza, as opposed to Baruch Spinoza, which is just the Latin version of Baruch. But he didn't convert to Christianity. He maintained his status as a citizen of Amsterdam, of Holland, without joining one of the churches. And that was a relatively radical thing to do. After the French Revolution, that becomes standard, but this is a while before. So cherem was used more as a threat than as an actual practice, but it did happen occasionally. And sometimes it would be done in a sort of temporary way and then could be rescinded if the person gave up and relented. But you did have this phenomenon available. Again, today it's irrelevant. Like, nobody cares. In fact, some people have periodically tried to rescind the cherem on Spinoza to reclaim him for the Jewish people. And cherem is so irrelevant, nobody cares about that either. They're already reading Spinoza. They're not. You don't need to resurrect him or rehabilitate him, because he has already been rehabilitated through the process of time. Okay, number 2. What are the major challenges that Israel faces, and how could addressing those issues influence relations between Israel and the Jewish diaspora?
Well, I mean, the list is long. The two that sort of pop into my mind, but are really more the things that I have the biggest issue with. So, of course, to pop into my mind would be the entwining religion and government that they did, which, I mean, I am definitely of the opinion that entwining religion and government always leads to trouble. And it's led to trouble. And then also, I mean, we talked before, I mean, just the very nature of trying to create a modern ethno state is problematic and is going to cause problems. And so I think that, you know, those are two very big challenges that, I mean, heck, if I think they could get through those two challenges, the other challenges would seem much smaller by comparison, because I think those really influence a lot of the other things.
Mhm.
I could take that a step further. Today or yesterday, there were anti-Israeli Arab demonstrations, for example, by radical right-wingers. And I think that Israel, first of all, they have the problem of what is a Jew, which we've talked about before, because clearly what is a Jew is very different depending on, you know, who's talking. And so that in itself is a problem when you say, well, all Jews are welcome, but yeah, maybe not so much depending on how they act. But there becomes a racist issue of literally, if we're this group, then the others are others. And then you end up with, well, how do we integrate the others into a Jewish state? And it's like that rock that you can never swallow, you know, that's always there. And also there's the economic issue. An awful lot of capital comes from outside of Israel into Israel, from the American Jewish community, who sometimes thinks that they should therefore have some say in what's going on in Israel because they've got the economic power. So that there's issues, problematical issues there. Even the issue you were talking about earlier, about the a bill that's in Congress, you know, and conditioning aid on certain things. Well, that's a problem for Israeli independence, in a sense, or sovereignty, in that this other nation is saying, like, hey, you have to do stuff for us because we're giving you aid. So those are real problems, and they can create issues between non-Israeli Jewish groups and Israeli Jewish groups.
You know, I will mention, I'm not at all condoning the anti-Arab riots that have happened in Israel, but there were also a whole series of attacks by Jerusalem Arabs, mainly young teenagers, on visibly Jewish people on the light rail train the few days before, and they were posted to TikTok and became sort of this, you know, phenomenon in itself. So it's this sort of tit for tat ethnic violence that gets very problematic, and then you have to see how is the government responding. Just this week, Human Rights Watch issued a report where they said that what's happening in the occupied territories in the West Bank and Gaza fits the definition of apartheid, or apartheid, if you want to say it more South African. And this has been sort of a red line in outside of Israel discourse, but people in Israel talk about it all the time. It's not a forbidden word. They talk about this as a threat, and a threat to Israel's democratic character. So, you know, what you're allowed to talk about Israel outside of Israel versus what you can talk about inside of Israel, who's allowed to talk about it. And I wouldn't poo-poo the environmental issues, things like water. You know, wars have been fought over oil, but wars are going to be fought over water. And fresh water in that area, with the level of population growth that's happening and the standard of living and water use that these people bring to the table, to the water table, that is going to be really challenging to manage, and will lead to ongoing tensions with surrounding countries as well. And how will this affect relations between Israel and the Jewish diaspora? I already alluded to this, that what the consensus perspective is already shifted, and how far can you go before being too far is really up for debate. I will mention an amusing anecdote from about 20 years ago. When I first started my rabbinic career, I found that my name had appeared on a website that was trying to list all of what they call the self-hating Israel threatening list, the self-hating Israel threatening list of Jews. But if you read that acronym, self-hating Israel threatening, it was the shit list. And I made it onto that list as a self-hating Israel threatening. And by the way, all the rabbis on the list had rabbi in quotes around the title. So I was Rabbi Adam Chalom. But it was fringe. It was, these are some kooks out there doing this stuff. But nowadays, if you are an advocate for Palestinian rights who's working in the Jewish community, it can be a very, very tough road to hoe, because it's very much seen as an us versus them. And it's very hard for people to accept that you can advocate for both Jewish national rights and Palestinian national rights as a parallel on the basis of ethnic self-determination. They really see it as a zero-sum game of us versus them, and better us getting rights than them. And that leads to challenges in relations between Jews and the diaspora, who are more committed to democratic values than many Jews living in Israel itself.
I found that when I was teaching that, it was a very difficult line to draw, because in class you want to present both sides of an argument, and right away I would get hammered on by, well, then you just hate Israel. You're an anti-Semite. No. But then the other side of it is, then you have the 242 resolutions, and you have, the Zionism is racism books, and that's not where you want to go either. So you're stuck between these two radical positions, and you're trying to steer a middle course, and it's very difficult to do so, because the yelling starts very quickly and the listening stops.
Right, absolutely. Okay, next one, number 3. What distinguishes secular humanistic Judaism from other modern Jewish alternatives, and what do they have in common? Well, you know what? I'm almost going to put I was going to put a pause in that one, because it isn't really what we've talked about a lot in this class, but we're going to be talking about it a lot in the next class on Jewish culture, because we're going to learn about the history of the holidays and how they've been celebrated, and how secular and humanistic Jews celebrate those holidays, or how they understand the Torah and Jewish literature, or how they understand dietary laws and dress laws and so on. So, our attitude toward intermarriage and assimilation is very different. Our definition of Jewish identity is very different, but these are topics that we cover in other parts of this adult education curriculum over the next couple of years when we talk about Jewish culture and talk about philosophy. So let's actually, in the interest of time, we'll sort of leave that as a teaser question, something that we get back to in future classes. Or honestly, we have lots of videos out there and lots of programs that we do in our congregation locally that explore these kind of questions. So I'm happy to point you to more detail on those if you're interested in more. And number 4 is a core question of this class. Why is a strong understanding of Jewish history important for secular humanistic Jews?
Well, I'd say, when you take out the theism, one of the things that I think secular humanistic Judaism has embraced as important to the community and identity is an embrace of Jewish history and how that informs humanistic philosophy, as opposed to purely focusing on the theology in a traditional, deity-centered sense. The Jewish history is a important part of Jewish identity and informing the values and mores of secular humanistic Judaism.
Mm-hmm. One other piece that I find really valuable about Jewish history is that it counts as doing Jewish. Doing Jewish isn't only reading prayers in the synagogue or studying the Torah in a traditional setting. It can be learning Jewish history. When I was an undergraduate, I majored in Jewish studies. And one year I had 4 religious studies classes in Hebrew in this particular semester. And someone asked me at one point, why don't you come to Hillel more often? I heard you're thinking of becoming a rabbi. Why aren't you at Hillel? And I said, oh man, I'm doing Jewish stuff all the time, because every homework assignment, all my I'm studying Hebrew 5 days a week. I'm doing Jewish stuff all the time. Where people who are majoring in economics or pre-med or whatever, they get their Jewish fix at Hillel, fine. But I was getting mine from studying and learning, and this counts as doing Jewish. And it connects with us in a very meaningful way. When I go to Jewish archaeological sites, I really feel a sense of a kind of historical transcendence, that my people were here and celebrated Jewish life here. One of the most striking experiences I had in my last trip to Israel in 2019, and I've been there several times before, but this was a new one for me. We went to visit an ancient synagogue in the north of Israel that has beautiful mosaic floors that date back to the Greco-Roman period around the 6th century, because it's in Greek, actually, some of the inscriptions, and some are in Hebrew or Aramaic. They have a picture of the zodiac, they have a picture of Apollo with his sun share. I mean, it's what we would think of as heretical now from a rabbinic perspective, but it was par for the course, evidently, for synagogues back then. And that experience was great enough. But then we had to leave a little early because they had to finish setting up chairs for a bar mitzvah that was taking place in that synagogue. And I said, wow, that is fantastic that you have this ancient synagogue that Jews celebrated in, including possibly some early version of a bar mitzvah, maybe. I mean, it develops a bit later historically, but they might have had some kind of honoring of the family or who knows what. And certainly reading from a Torah scroll and having Jewish community gather in that space. There was a gap when it was destroyed and buried for 1,000, 1,500 years, and then it's been rediscovered in the 1990s, and now you can have bar mitzvahs in the same place again. I mean, that was fantastic. So that's the fruits of Jewish history, is that kind of experience. And finally, I think that it's consistent with our philosophy to try and find the real truth, to accept the truth, whatever it is, even if we're not comfortable with it. And to be honest, the traditional narratives of Jewish history don't support our perspective. They don't conform to our sense of what reality is. So if we're going to tell that as the Jewish story, that doesn't work. It works as a story. That's fine. You can have magic and miracles and gods and stories, but that isn't how we understand the world to really work. So those are some of the reasons why I find Jewish history to be an important part of doing Jewish for me. Number 5, and there's no fixed answer to this question, what do you feel are the most important practices of Jewish identity, and what can be dropped or changed while still identifying the group or individual as Jewish, and what cannot? Like, what are the non-negotiables that once you drop it, either they're not going to be Jewish anymore or they're going to vanish too fast and it's not going to stick around?
Yeah, that's a tough one.
I didn't say they were easy.
I mean, I think for the first sort of part of the question, what do you feel the most important practices of Jewish identity, are probably whatever encourages a feeling of Jewish identity in the practicer. So, I mean, there are some practices that's not going to do anything for me, but could do a lot for someone else, while things that, I get a lot from, other people aren't going to get a lot from. The second question is harder. When the first thing that pops into my head is being Christian. But other than that.
Well, I mean, there are, Messianic Jews who claim a Jewish identity, even if they believe Yeshua is a Messiah in some ways. And, I mean, ethnically, they're part of the Jewish people. Look, we don't agree on Jewish theology either. And by the way, there are Lubavitch or ultra-Orthodox Jews who think their Rebbe was the Messiah. He's just Menachem instead of Yeshua, and they expect him to come back. So, it's just a new Jewish messianism. I mean, you might pick big holidays like the high holidays or Passover, that if you don't have a Passover, then you're sort of stuck. I mean, even the Soviet Jews had a Passover because, look, worker rebellion against oppressive boss, that's tailor-made for socialism, right? But if you don't have a Passover, maybe it doesn't count. Maybe you need to have some kind of Jewish language connection, even if it's just the bad jokes and the foods. You got to have some kind of lingo to be part of the group. Maybe if it just calls itself Jewish or claims a Jewish ancestry. Look, there are a lot of people out there who are sending in their DNA to be tested. And they find out they have 5% Jewish DNA or 3% Jewish DNA. And all of a sudden, they're so interested in exploring their Jewish identity. Now, I'm not saying that to mock it, because if it's meaningful to them, then it's meaningful. And we are not the arbiters of what counts as meaningful. If they want to explore that part of themselves, we are happy to have them do so. And sometimes they learn and say, okay, that's nice. Now they know a little bit more, and then they, put it in the family album and they're done. But for other people, it really spurs a personal pursuit, and they decide to identify more with that part of their family, and That's great. But, they're coming from nothing. They don't have any memories of Passover Seders or lighting Hanukkah candles, but they feel a biological connection, and that's their entree, and that might work too. So the last question, this is where we do have to put on our prophet hat, even if we're nonprofit organizations. What will be the most important challenges for future generations of secular and humanistic Jews? And what challenges they face today might have been resolved?
Global
Well,
warming.
I think
Global warming, okay. In which category? It's a future challenge, or will it have been resolved? Sorry, Al, you were going to say?
yeah, I was going to say, maintaining their secularism as the world becomes more secular at the same time, is the Christian world and us kind of evolved to a common mind thought kind of a thing.
There was a study that came out last month that pointed out that for the first time in the Pew study, a majority of Americans were not a member of a religious institution. That historically in America, 70% or higher have been members of some kind of church or synagogue or mosque or whatever. And this was the first time it dipped below 50%. It was like 48% said they're a member of a religious institution. And so I posted this on Facebook in a humanistic Jewish discussion group, and I said, is this good for the Jews or bad? Is it good for the secular Jews, or is it bad for the secular Jews? Because on one level, you think, oh, if society in general is secularizing, it becomes more acceptable, and then they're more likely to identify as secular Jews, and they might join our communities. But the flip side is, if the ethos of joining anything that calls itself religious or is structured like a religious group becomes the minority quirky experience, and certainly in parts of urban and suburban life, it's already that. Remember, the affiliation rates in small towns may be way higher than they are in urban and suburban settings. So, you talk to people who are college graduates who are living in Manhattan, in the Upper West Side or whatever, unless they're Orthodox or traditionalists, they might not be a member anywhere and still feel very Jewish. And that's the ethos. Having a private bar mitzvah in your backyard, that becomes the norm. So that might not be so good for us if society around secularizes more and more. I'll give you one other example. We are faced with the same challenge that every Jewish Sunday school is facing right now. It's called soccer. Because soccer no longer avoids Sunday mornings. For a long time, they did, because all the Christians had to go to church and had to go to Sunday school. And so there was a window there where Jewish communities could also do their educational programs on Sunday morning and not have to worry about soccer. But as society becomes more secular, soccer encroaches. And gradually, the soccer games start not at 2 in the afternoon, but at 1 or at 12:30 or at 12 or at 11. And we have less and less time for our Sunday schools. So a secular surrounding society is not always what we wanted it to be. Now, some other challenges that I think future generations will have. There are increasing numbers of families who feel like they can celebrate both traditions religiously. Where for a long time, we had sort of the cachet. We were the only ones in terms of rabbis, or very few, one of the very few rabbis who were willing to officiate at intermarriage ceremonies, who were willing to allow families to celebrate both holidays. But our approach tended to fit better with an intercultural family where they're both secularized, but they like to do Christmas and Hanukkah and Passover and Easter, with Easter being the Easter bunny and not the passion story and the resurrection story, okay? But as, again, people become a little more secularized, you get more tolerance, more diversity. Now they want to do both a religious Christianity and a religious Judaism. We're not the best fit for them because of our secular and humanistic philosophy. And so that's a population that's shifting, and we'll have to figure out what we want to do in response to that. The rise of traditional Jewish practice, the Reform movement has added more Hebrew, and the conservative movement has become more traditional in some ways. Are we tempted in the same direction? Are we going to lose our sense of distinction the more traditional we appear if we add more Hebrew, if we add more ritual practice? I mean, there was a discussion on the Humanistic Judaism Facebook discussion group about wearing a kippah, traditional Jewish head covering, you would have never had 30 years ago. because 30 years ago, we were breaking away from that religiously looking behavior. No talis, no kippah, no way. The discussion that happened recently, a large number of people said, you know what? I wear it because it makes me feel Jewish. And if we really take our philosophy seriously and say people can make up their own minds, then they might make up their minds differently than we would have 30 years ago. And that's good. I mean, that's being consistent, but it also means things are going to look different in a humanistic Jewish congregation in 30 years than they look today. And you know what? The other challenge we have is people have taken what I call the postmodern approach to Jewish texts. It used to be really, really important whether or not Moses wrote the Torah, right? That was a vital question. People argued over it. And nowadays they take the postmodern approach of who cares when it was written? Who cares who wrote it? I'm interested in the text as received. The text as the rabbis understood it. The multivocality of the text. And so they lost the argument, right? I mean, the evidence for non-Mosaic authorship is overwhelming, both archaeologically and source critical, and even from evidence within the text of how the text refers to itself or how it's referred to in other parts of the Bible. So whatever your metric, they lost the argument about Moses writing the Torah, but they said, well, who cares about that argument anyways? So that they can still say, this is the Torah that Moses placed before the children of Israel, from the mouth of God by the hand of Moses. They don't want to change that because that's tradition. But they have to admit it's not what they believe. So now prayer has become not what you believe, but a kind of historical reenactment or a truth on a spiritual level or some other version that isn't, this is what I believe. Now, we in Secular Humanistic Judaism care a lot about what we believe. We adapt our Jewishness to fit what we believe. But we're the outliers. Many more American Jews care less about what it means and more about what it sounds like. And if it sounds like what they're used to, then they'll stick with it. Now, issues in the past that may have been resolved as we go forward. We're getting more and more accepted in the broader Jewish community. We're on the map, so to speak. More and more people can find us. You know, that technology that creates the Zoom, creates a YouTube video, creates search capabilities, which helps people find us and feel connected, even if they're in random scattered spaces all across the country or the world. I mean, you know, we have people from Florida on this program, as well as someone from Romania. I mean, this was unheard of before Zoom and before the modern experience. And that helps people find us, which is great. And as time goes on, more will have heard of who we are and what we do. And I've actually heard accurate things about who we are and what we do. And I think that will be a positive. And I think in the long run, we will find sort of a happy medium of how to organize our communities such that the people who don't like organized religion, but like the idea of having a professional teacher and regular events to bring the community together, might make their peace with a humanistic rabbi and a humanistic congregation, even if 50 years ago, that would have been the last thing they would have wanted, because they were not only anti-religion, they were anti-anything religious-ish. So the word congregation, the word rabbi was haram, was forbidden. But now maybe that shifted a little bit, even in the secular Jewish world. And as more Jews evolve out of Reform Conservative and other Judaisms to more secular versions, they may well find a comfortable home with us. We bring everything they want without the things they don't want.
I myself am rather optimistic about really the future of the secular humanistic Judaism model of an explicitly humanistic, non-theistic, sort of congregational sort of thing, because I do think that there's traditionally and still among a lot of people sort of as someone who's been a member of lots of humanistic and atheist and all kinds of groups, a lot of people who had negative early interactions with religion of any kind will have the sort of knee-jerk anti-anything they associate with religion. But as the world is getting more secular and more people are just being raised without those negative experiences, just without religion in general, you don't have the same negative associations with kippot or with congregational sort of settings. And there's a reason that so many religious groups had these sort of congregational settings and things because they fulfill human desires. And I've noticed, you have the creation of these sort of like the Sunday assembly, where specifically an attempt to take the good things, the congregational models, singing and getting together with people regularly and having some sort of activity that's not based on a sports event or something like that, and where they can talk about values and things outside of theism and all that kind of stuff. I think that satisfies a real craving, and I think that I think secular humanistic Judaism, of course, is absolutely excellent for that, and I think that it's well established. It's got a lot of great things, and I think it really fulfills that need very well, and I think it's going to do very well as more people become aware of it. And so I am very optimistic that I think that it really fits a need of all the benefits of sort of the traditional religion with none of the unfortunate religion part.
Well, as they say, Im Yirtzeh Hashem, if God wills it, or Inshallah, then we'll see that happen. Well, I want to thank you all for coming. Laura, you have a last thought?
Yeah, I just wanted to sort of counter that a little bit, because I have a much longer experience than Ren in terms of over 70 years. And I must say that when I grew up in New York, every professional that I went to was a friend of my family who was Jewish. My optometrist, my dentist, my doctor, everybody. And I lived in a neighborhood that, except for my mother and Mrs. Goldman, was entirely Jewish. And that's not true anymore. And the communities, the younger generation is moving out to weird places like Northern Florida, as opposed to Miami, which is where they're supposed to be. I mean, but even places like Highland Park and Deerfield becoming less Jewish. And as the younger kids are moving out and they're marrying sometimes non-Jews, and they're living in Iowa and in Mississippi, it becomes harder for a community to maintain its integrity. Now, the answer may be the electronic aspect, which you mentioned. And I again, that's something that needs to be integrated. But that to me, I think, is a challenge for any of these congregations, just because of the new diaspora, if you will.
I will add, though, that as people become more dispersed, the affiliation need is stronger.
Yeah.
That is, in your New York neighborhood, who needed to join anything? Everybody was Jewish.
Yeah.
But in settings where you're a little more dispersed, you might want to join something. The question is whether you have critical mass to actually create something.
Yeah.
And then the other piece that's valuable is that in the last 30 years, there's really been a shift in the conversation of what to do about intercultural intermarried families. It was always thought to be a dead end. They're gone. They're dead to us. The kids are never going to be Jewish. There's really been a shift in the Jewish conversation on this, which realized it was the Jewish community saying they were dead that made them leave. Like, if we take a different approach and we say, you've married, we're thrilled, you found someone you love, let's find a way for you to integrate some Jewishness in what you're doing, whether it's free books at home with PJ Library or online programming or kids videos that you can play or all kinds. I mean, there's really an effort to be inclusive of multi-heritage Jewish families who want to do something Jewish. And it's had results. In that Pew study that we'll be talking about next time, something like 60% of the children in intercultural families are getting some kind of Jewish identity. It could be religiously Jewish, it could be culturally Jewish, it could be Jewish and something else, but they're all getting some kind of Jewish identity, which is a record high compared to the 1990 or the 2000 study, where it was way less than 50%. Now it's 60%, and that's a function of that changing circumstance where they can find a rabbi to marry them, they can find a synagogue that will let them both be members, and they can find synagogues that will let the non-Jewish partner on the bima for the bar and bat mitzvah event, and that will affirm the Jewishness of their family in the way that they've chosen to be Jewish. So that new landscape may have a real, galvanizing impact on the size of the Jewish community going forward.